Welcome to a Seeds of Wellbeing Voices from the Field podcast featuring voices of Hawaii agriculture producers for Hawaii agriculture producers. These podcasts are made possible by a grant from the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, also known as CTAR, and the Seeds of Wellbeing, or SO project, and is supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. Aloha, listeners. Welcome again to another episodes of the Seeds of Wellbeing. We have Vincent Kimura on this episode, and Vincent Kimura is currently president of Smart Eel, as well as the Honolulu chapter of the Hawaii Farm Union United. I'm just going to start off and ask Vincent to share a little bit about himself and his relationship with the ag community.
Vincent. Aloha, Tal. Thanks so much for having me on. So I'm from Hawaii, born here on Oahu, and I have, like most of us, have roots in my grandparents, my grandfather specifically, being in agriculture. So he came over really early on. I'm a third generation Japanese. And he came over and worked the sugarcane fields, and then had a dream to do something different, and then eventually left Kauai to go off on his own journey. For me, agriculture is my, I would say, an involved career, being involved in supporting producers. And the journey kind of went all around because I grew up in Asia most of my life, and then eventually came back to Hawaii to raise a family and work. So most of my experience has been around working in consulting and technology and innovation and all that good stuff. And so when I first got entree into agriculture, I was working in the post-harvest, so food safety. And that was really interesting because it was looking at the challenges both small growers and large growers face to attain both shelf life extension, but also ensure that they're able to sell to larger markets. So institutional buyers, be it the retail supermarkets or to the Department of Education or to others. And so it was really fascinating to kind of see. And a lot of that, I, of course, give huge kudos and thanks to CTAR and University of Hawaii for kind of bringing me under. And I fondly remember we did this crazy road show across every single island. We did, what did we do? Like 5 islands in 4 days. So it was just a lot of work. But thankfully, with the help of a lot of the extension folks, I really got a crash course in understanding, mostly from the academic side. So looking at research and how extension is working to support growers. And then that evolved to better understanding about soil health and regenerative agriculture, which is, the myriad effects of looking at how we treat our soil and how we treat our gut health as just such direct correlation. And, even as a young child growing up in Asia and always getting sick and always taking, antibiotics, and then realizing, wow, okay, you're killing all the good and the bad stuff, and you need to really focus on rebuilding a really healthy gut, much degree of rebuilding really healthy soil, and valuing that. And also the realization that, with a lot of these amazing mentors that I've held space for in my life, we're still trying to understand all the intricacies of, both our gut biome and our soil biome. And I always often appreciate what Da Vinci said way back in the day, which is we know more about the celestial bodies overhead than the soil under our feet. And so, bringing it all back to center, we started a technology company focusing on supporting small farmers using, sensors and data and aerial imagery from drones or satellites. We tried a bunch of different things to see where was that stickiness component in the mushroom capital of the United States and Kennett Square to small growers in Crimea to small farmers in the Marshall Islands to our largest project was actually in the western slopes of Colorado. We're working with apples, peaches, grape growers. And it was really fascinating to learn about how growers are using information to make better decisions. And at the end of the day, eventually I joined the Farmers Union board for the Wyoming president. And then I was on the statewide executive committee. And it's always one of those hindsight things where, I wish I had done that earlier, but I don't think I was ready to really understand that. But again, some of the most amazing mentors in pre-Farmers Union days when it was called the Hawaii Organic Farming Association, Glenn Martinez and Pam Boyer and Vince Mina and whatnot, and then that evolved to the Farmers Union. So I think one of the biggest aha specifically around that piece is the realization that farming is hard. Farmers can make money, they'll farm. And really it comes down to economics in the day, because the financial sustainability of things and looking at the inputs and looking at the labor costs and looking at land access and looking at water access and all these other things. And then of course you look at the revenue streams from just selling produce versus expanding it to selling value-added goods. So from all this experience, I had an amazing mentor in Holland who taught me so much about value chains. And it was really interesting because I could take my business brain, my MBA side of things from Michael Porter's concept on value chains and apply it into agriculture and look at how folks like myself who want to support growers. And what I mean by support growers is, at the end of the day, the growers, the producers, the folks taking the majority of the risk have to be the ones taking the majority of the profits. Mm-hmm. And they have to be at the table making decisions for their own livelihood. And that is really important and really different from how I first learned an entree into agriculture, which is I saw a lot of folks in the industry, in the value chain, taking the majority of the profits. Mm-hmm. And then when I started hearing all these challenges on the workforce development side, which is, average age of a farmer is like 60s. We need to grow more farmers. I mean, I remember giving talks around the world and talking about how to bring more youth into agriculture. And then I would hear these comments about how, especially in Hawaii, farmers here are lifestyle farmers and how we need to support them to become professional farmers. And then the realization is like the numbers just don't add up. And so, but the other piece of it is really fascinating is why are we saying we need to actually grow more professional farmers when in fact it is not set up in our ecosystem to ensure that their risk is lower. So that's really important for me. I'll pause there.
Okay. Thank you, Vincent. That was quite a bit. It shows the depth and breadth of your experiences that you have. And I know that when you were HFU executive team, you applied for the grants from RASAP, and you highlighted one of the few people that I came into contact. In fact, you were the first person that really also helped me to understand that mental and behavioral health issues needs to be recognized and acknowledged. So could you share a bit about what was your impetus and motivation to even apply for that pilot grant with RASAP, even before we did, in terms of this Seeds of Wellbeing project?
So I have a whole lot of gratitude for my own personal development and journey as an entrepreneur. And, I was giving these presentations all around the world to different trade groups. So, talking to the horticulture groups, to various different ag tech startup organizations, to everyone under the sun. And, again, agriculture is predominantly the oldest industry in the world. And yet, when you look at how it has evolved through the Industrial Revolution, the use of mechanized equipment, and then how it has changed the landscape, literally and figuratively, to focus on, monocrop, large-scale agriculture. And then I would hear these stories from growers, because that was my big thing. So I fondly remember, there's really interesting articles that one of them in particular was published out of the Guardian, out of the UK, and the title of it was something like, "Why Are America's Farmers Killing Themselves?" And so that was something where I'm just like, what is going on? And then I started looking at the CDC data that this one particular journalist used, and how agricultural workers and farmers were unfortunately committing suicide at a degree higher than that of our veterans. And then I started looking at all these things and started talking to folks and asking, and there's a huge stigma within the agriculture community around talking about that and being okay with that and being present. And so, looking at all the economic side and looking at the mental health side of things and the numbers, and I'm such a big data wonk. I just love numbers. And again, trying to understand, even down to Hawaii, we use this number about we import 80-90% of our food. And then I went down the rabbit hole, and I'm the kind of individual that I love looking at research, and then I love looking at footnotes, and then I love looking at the footnotes and finding out where the research comes from. And then of course I reached out to the original authors of it and started asking more questions. And so, simply put, is even they don't know why or exactly how people just started adopting this number, and there's still a lot of holes and questions where we just need more data. And the mental health side has become personally something very near and dear. And when I was giving this presentation in Colorado, and I was talking to this insurance agent, and I was telling him these stories of how farmers I would talk to would say, "Don't buy the John Deere tractor, buy the Kubota one, because the John Deere tends to roll over more and people die." And I'm like, that's interesting. And then I found out information that the the largest financial debt holder of agricultural equipment across at least the United States is John Deere. And I'm thinking, okay. And then I was talking to this insurance guy, and I was just sharing some of the stuff around mental health. And I did my presentation already. And he came to me afterwards. He's like, I had modified it at the end where, it's not about adopting technology. It's not about this. It's at the end of the day for agriculturalists, from what I had seen, it's about legacy. It's about, ensuring that what they have built in terms of this operation, this business, lives on, whether it's their children or someone else who appreciates it. And so there's this really big hurdle, like mindset-wise, where this transfer of knowledge piece, generational knowledge from failures and successes, were hard to pass on without data, technology, record keeping, et cetera. And so this insurance agent comes up to me and he's like, Vince, I heard your presentation, and and so we started talking, and he's like, so this is really funny because he had just joined this insurance company, life insurance company, and include crop insurance too. And he said, while he was there, the insurance company changed they amended their policy whereby if you join their policy and if you commit suicide in the first 2 years, they will not pay out. Mm-hmm. And so I started thinking about all these stories and data points around there about, okay, well, now it's an accident. And this one article says too, straight up, that a lot of these numbers might be heavily skewed because there's so many farm accidents around tractors rolling over. I'm thinking whether it's true or not is irrelevant, but clearly there's a trend here where if you can empathize with someone who is, cash flow is king in any business, especially in agriculture, and the only option you feel like is on the table to ensure your family is taken care of is for you to take your own life. And then you hear stories about how farmers, they're different, at least in the stories around suicide, where, they don't take and this is really wrong, this is really terrible, but they don't take a gun because they don't want their family to have to clean up. And you hear about all these things, I'm just like, wow, this is so terrible. Mm-hmm. So fast forward to COVID, I'm on the executive board, and our annual conventions for the Farmers Union is typically where we find most of our membership. It's an amazing time. I think someone said this to me early on, one of my other mentors, who said, the great thing about the Farmers Union in particular is that we love coming together because it's such a great time, but the food is so amazing because it's farm fresh. You know, it's grown from the farmers who eat it themselves for their families. And, you know, majority of it is regenerative agriculture, so they use a lot of, you know, Korean natural farming and bokashi and effective mechanisms and, you know, soil-related things. So, you know, generally speaking, they're not considered organic, but they follow principles around like, hey, if we eat it ourselves and we feed it to our kids and our family, then, you know, we're not going to give it to someone else who there's a whole bunch of other things in there too. And then so we would always joke, we come for the food and we stay for the fellowship and the people and just having the most amazing time, sharing, learning. And so I learned a great deal of how to have gratitude for these family farmers and how, you know, the way I had been taught or said, well, you know what, we need to consolidate, it needs to be larger, it needs to be huge plantation styles because that's how you make a living. And then I hear about all these other challenges and whatnot. And I have some amazing friends and mentors who really helped me understand who come from, you know, seed companies and GMOs. And, you know, why would I think that their livelihood or their business or their career is different than anyone else's? And I think, you know, at the end of the day, I kept seeing more and more individuals outside that are not producers telling farmers what they should do or what should not do. And I'm thinking, you know, who am I to judge? Because I'm not doing this to make a living. Who am I to say that they should be doing this versus that? And to truly understand it is to truly kind of make space and spend time with it. So I decided then to be an advocate and a supporter and put my energy towards what I knew, which is, you know, trade shows and fundraising and applying for grants and helping others kind of see and bring folks like yourself to kind of come experience and meet. And so, you know, COVID hit, we couldn't do in person. The farm tours piece was the greatest thing because that was, you know, in agriculture in general, you know, there's this kind of zero-sum mentality. And, you know, it's until you can really support a grower or producer to see that their neighbors or other growers producing the same thing are not the competitors. They're not that. And you can grow it out, but the only way to do that is to look at value added, to see how we can collectively, you know, work together. And you see this in almost every single association of, you know, how can the collective we be greater than the sum of our individual parts? And so, you know, this cooperative-ish model, especially when you can have co-ops support infrastructure development, and you start looking at, of course, our land costs are, you know, the highest predominantly in the country. Our kilowatt per hour and energy costs are the highest in the country. So when you think about cold storage, which is the only way you can extend shelf life, and you think about the transportation costs in between islands, you think all these different things, there's no way a small grower can really do this unless they figure out a way to focus more on ag tourism. But obviously through COVID, that was tough. So we were looking at moving, and we took some funds that we were going to put for farm tours at the convention. And I was like, hey, let's go and make videos where it's not the same experience, but at least it's a way to capture. And we called it HFU Heroes, like Farmer Heroes. And so I had this crazy idea of when you look at like wedding videos, and wedding videos like follow this exact same kind of like structure, this imagery to this transition to this kind of music, and then you're looking at it, you're crying, you're like, oh my God, you're tearing up. And so the same idea I thought would be effective, which is, you know, let's not spend money on sending videographers across. We worked with a company called, oh my goodness, it was Wanderlust. It was a really amazing duo that was here, and you know, and so we had a limited budget, but we did videos of all these different farmers, and we had different videographers on each island, so we could put more of the funding instead of paying for travel costs to the local ones. And I, gave them the parameters, gave them that. We helped them with the whole script. We helped them with kind of the vision and the transitions, and they went off and did it, and then they did post-production. And what came back was a really interesting use case of like, how might we be able to show different stories on the positive side of things, whereby, it's the same thing when you go to a winery. You fall in love with the story, you fall in love with the growers, whereby in future you become a great ambassador and tell everyone about your experience. But then also as a consumer, when you go to the store, you're willing to pay a premium because you know who they are and where it comes from. And, it's not about spending for the cheapest dollar. It's about supporting a grower and someone in their family. So we wanted to kind of build that culture of this heroes concept. And then from the heroes, that's where we started looking at really the mental health thing, because Reba O'Day, now Reba Lopez, who was the Haleakala chapter president, we were chatting about this, and Haleakala chapter started right before COVID hit a tent space, and they made it really fun. It was couches, and they did this like hakule workshops, and they did talks, and it was very Burning Man-esque in the sense of like, it's a comfortable space where people can come to and just hang out. And that was amazing. So we started talking about like, well, how do we create more of this culture of being there? And it's not about talking about depression, anxiety, and suicide. And not talking about stresses, because everyone's stressed out. It's about just being there. Again, very like supportive. What I've experienced at Burning Man, and just having a lot of gratitude and intention, and doing things in a way where it's not the daytime activities, education, it's the nighttime quiet conversations that we most connect with others. So having more of that is the importance. So I found this funding source, RASUP, and I pitched it to the executive committee. They agreed, and so we worked on creating 3 different proposals. I think total we got about $70,000, and it was across trying to support other cultures, other farming communities. So we targeted our Thai Laotian community, because they were a group that has a very large presence in Hawaii, but yet they, in my work at the Pacific Gateway Center, were a group that weren't necessarily considered like the Farmers Union or the Farm Bureau. So what we thought of was, well, how do we take a lot of things we teach and then we convert it so there's not necessarily a language barrier, where we can bring them inside our community and support them, and we could extend it starting with this. We did more of this kind of farmer sharing, Farmers Union Heroes piece. And that's when, I was mentioning this to one of my mentors, and she's like, you need to talk to, Auntie Kahau, and that was the connection with you and I. So
yeah. So story sharing. I mean, I think you're very big about story sharing and bringing people together to share each other life stories and meaning making. And I think what you're trying to say is providing more opportunity for networking so that one doesn't feel alone in all the challenges and uncertainty. So what is your sense? Because on the mainland, we keep hearing reports like, the Surgeon General saying 1 out of 2 are feeling lonely, and it's even higher among farming community, particularly in the rural areas. Do you see that in Hawaii among our farmers?
Yeah. When we started, so I took over as Wanderlust chapter president, and one of the things I appreciate the most is the farm tours and the gathering. It was always potluck. That's the great thing about the union is, bringing stuff, and a lot of chapters would do different things, like they would do like a best dish award or whatever. So there was a lot of pride in what people brought. Early in my career, I was on the Food Manufacturers Association board too, and so one of the things we started there was this taste awards, where we challenged amazing chefs in the state to do 3 things. One is they were ranked based on the percentage of ingredients sourced local. So that really got them out of the box. So I remember hearing some amazing chefs say, wow, I never knew. Like, it was really, they were so accustomed to just ordering from their traditional suppliers, which of course the majority of it was not grown local. So that was really getting out of their box, which is great because now they had a supply chain where they can continue to source local. And the other thing too is, of course, the presentation side of things. So how does this align with the culture, and et cetera? So they were doing some really amazing pieces on the marketing, the visual presentation. And then the third thing, of course, was things. And so I think we can all agree that, things that are grown fresher, that aren't picked early, and that aren't shipped in, refrigerated containers for months and stored. I mean, at the end of the day, it just comes down to bricks, BRX levels, like the sugar levels. If you pick something too early, you have to chemically ripen it. And so if it doesn't have those sugars and nutrients, you're eating cellulose. You're not eating healthy nutrition. So you can't compare a banana grown in Central America versus a local apple banana grown here that was harvested, days ago. It's just not the same. So the same thing goes in agriculture as well. The more we can have of this sharing piece, the more we can have of changing this mentality and this culture of zero sum, the more we can have people supporting people. And I remember doing my research and thinking about, when you look at agriculture back in the day, where a farmer in a community would raise a barn, like that's literally like the whole concept, and the community would come together, and all the the men and the horses and whatnot would come, and then all the families, the women, etc., would come, and they would have this huge potluck or huge dinner afterwards and celebrate, and it was a community gathering piece. And so then I would see growers. That's the one thing I really appreciate is seeing agriculture across the world and hearing how they have grown and changed. I remember talking to growers in the western southern Colorado, and they would lament on how all the Californians are coming over and buying ag lands and being gentlemen farmers. And I could hear this divide, this energy of like them versus us. Mm. And it was really sad because at the end of the day, without that olive branch, without that kind of, our forefathers' generation of, sharing a cup of sugar or whatever, this is why we're currently in the state we are. This is why when we think about being lonely, I mean, even if they're right next door, they feel like they can't reach out because they haven't had that level of trust building. And that's why organizations like the union and other organizations that do this are so important. I've always believed personally that collaboration and community building are the most important thing, because in the end of the day, it's not about money or it's about technology or it's about whatever. It's about interpersonal human relationships. Now, those relationships are there. Nothing's going to work. It's not about. We are our own worst enemy. We self-sabotage everything. So when we feel like that person is stealing stuff or doing stuff in spite of, and there hasn't been that level of relationship building, then it will never really succeed. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah, so we've conducted interviews, about 80 interviews with farmers as part of our needs assessment project, and one of the themes that came up was some of the farmers, the older generation farmers, were saying how it's different. There used to be a lot more community events, community activity, community gathering, and they've noticed that that's decreased over the years, and they're really concerned about this current generation. If we're trying to develop the workforce or attract the younger folks to come into farming, and if they're more of this like, oh, there's so much uncertainty, risk aversion, we want more security, and also it feels like a lot of our young folks are feeling lonely and struggling. So, but on the other hand, I'm hearing you're saying that there's all these communities that are building, and I've seen that too, right? We've got a lot of different farmers group, but yet I imagine there's a group of folks who are still left to, they're not part of the community. They're struggling on their own, and our data even showing that close to 1 out of 2 of our young farmers under 45 are saying, I've got depressive symptomology and even suicidal ideation. So how do we reach out to these individuals, or what structures and processes needs to be in place to make sure that there's a safeguard and protection? Do you have any ideas?
So thankfully, thanks to you and the rest of the Season Wellbeing team, I joined as one of the first cohort for the Ag Mentors program. And, you know, it wasn't just on a professional or interest level for me. There was a personal story too, is why I wanted to learn more about how to understand, how to be comfortable in really uncomfortable situations, talking about mental health for myself, for my family, for everyone around me, and not to be afraid to ask those questions and to be present and to hold space for that. So I have a lot of gratitude for that personally. And then, you know, I've always been a big fan of therapy. I think everyone should go have a therapist, you know, so, but in our rural communities, access to that is really difficult. And I mean, one of the things I've seen too is that if you surround yourself in a culture, which is the city and urban areas, and you take things like for granted, like I remember early on, a lot of the legislatures would be like, well, if the farmers, you know, really felt deeply or strongly about this, they would show up and testify. And then I held that same kind of mentality. I'm like, well, yeah, why? And then I started spending more time and understanding and seeing what it takes to actually operate, a successful farm. And success is, by all means, such an ambiguous term because, at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie. So it's difficult to see the changes. So your question around the older generation, the mental resiliency, yeah, because they have more life experience and they have a deeper kind of relationship with people that they've grown up with, and they've seen probably a lot more turmoil. You know, this right now is the longest period of, well, peace, since. And I feel like, you know, especially with my generation, and then, you know, kind of the generations after me, you know, there's kind of this changing of a culture side of things where, you know, whether you talk about inclusivity or women's rights or minority rights or all lives matter, you know, Black lives, etc. There's definitely a shift in culture. I think I have changed my own perspective of holding space on all the negativity because it's there. If someone doesn't believe it, they just have to go and research it. But what I do like to share is, you know, I've met young growers who were, you know, Silicon Valley startup developers making, you know, good money. And during COVID, they decided to buy a farm in, you know, in South Kona or Captain Cook or whatever it is, you know, and it's just like, and when I met them, I asked them like, why? They're like, because we're tired of the rat race. We're tired of raising ourselves and our kids up, and they want it different. And there's a really fascinating thing, which is what I probably appreciate the most about producers and growers, is that, you know, there's this level of balance, because when you, especially growers that follow more of a regenerative mindset, it's a culture. And so being surrounded by nature, being in an environment where, you know, you want to cultivate, you know, worms and nematodes and all these other things. You want to cultivate diversity. You want to do various different types of practices, you know, because you see the value. And, you know, I remember one of my mentors, Uncle Bobby Pahia over in Maui, he would tell me about like how he first got started off, and then how, you know, Uncle Vincent would talk about, you know, just kind of not pushing hard, but like, hey, come check this out. And then seeing is believing. You know, that's the other thing I remember like chatting with you about early on, is that, you know, every farm in the world, as much as they appreciate research and academia, you know, there's so much risk and change and difference between, you know, research land versus production land. And you can't view the two as synonymous. And just understanding soil health will give you that like purview. You know, just because it happens here doesn't mean it's going to happen there. And that's why it's like, well, why don't you try it on so-and-so's land? And if they succeed, then I'll actually, maybe potentially try it in a small plot just to see if it works. But the risk factor is so great. There's a great book, which is really indicative of your question, that was written by Warren Buffett's son, and it's called 40 Chances. And what I got out of it, which was really interesting, is that every farm in the world has 40 years, 40 harvests, 40 cycles to make it. So when you think of that level of risk, you think of like, if one of those harvests, because cash flow, doesn't make it, like that's the reason why there's this general, mistrust, distrust, and caution. And that's really hard to think about, especially if you've never grown up in that. And that's also a reason why you think about the old generation who've seen more, done more. Most of the older generation had to, they're a Renaissance individual. They didn't just farm, and so going back to my comment about, a community raising a barn together, going back to our forefathers, when you think about our founding fathers of our country, they weren't just, legislators, they were farmers too. Like everyone did it all. And that's the piece where it kind of surprises me that we think of like, well, we need to have people that are just farmers. Like, why? Most of the most successful farmers that I've met, right? But they're still doing it. They were accountants by training. They led different lives. They did all these different things, and all that comes together. Where it's like, why would you just want someone who's just farming? And then you look at our youth. The fact that we don't really emphasize, woodworking, workshop, electrical, all these trades things. It all comes back to our education. So if you lose all those things where you feel like you can't do it yourself and you need to rely on someone else, well, that's more cost. You have to hire consultants to do that. You can't work the fields by yourself. So you have to relearn that thing. So, I would love to see more classes on like how to drive a tractor, how to work this thing. Like that would be fun for me. That'd be fun for a lot of people. Like who doesn't want to work on heavy machinery, So, and it's been fun too. Like my youngest, I've taken him around on different farm tours and fields, and he would fondly say he wants to be a chef and a farmer, and now he wants to be a chef and a fisherman. But I think just exposure is a really big thing. Getting them out there. It's not just about pumpkin patches.
Right.
It's about seeing where your food comes from, and that piece is across the board. It's a cultural question of where do we want to put our efforts. It's not just on data and cyber, but it's diversifying each individual's so that they're just stronger people. They can do different things. It's no longer the culture of our parents and grandparents where you stay in one career your entire career.
So it sounds like the farmer nowadays needs to do everything or know how to do everything, do problem solving skills and being flexible, adaptable to all the changes that are happening so quickly. That's going to be a huge skill.
Well, I think it's working smarter, not harder necessarily, because again, much like all of our grandparents or great-grandparents who try to create a better life for future generations, especially as an Asian, there's a reason why they push to become doctors and lawyers or whatever, and the only difference now is that with the Great Resignation and all these things that are coming around, I'm pretty hopeful. You have to be, because change, although is difficult, it's scary, but it's also putting a really big spotlight of what has worked and what hasn't worked. And that's why, my personal call to action is for other folks out there who, might not necessarily be growers or producers, but to support agriculture. You want to do drones, you want to do this, great, continue to do that. But we in agriculture, collectively, we need more of that. And so the only way you're going to be able to lower the cost is to expand it and bring more to it and do it and learn. Because otherwise, the barrier to entry, the barrier to adoption is too great. So, the value added side, if anything, with the future of robotics and other things like that, we have to be looking towards the future. We have to be looking towards hedging risk. So it's my belief that, whether you're a seed farmer, you're a cattle rancher, you're a greenhouse tomato grower, you're a small 1 acre diversified, family farm, you're an indoor, metro grow, that Carrie Kakazu is doing. It's not up to us to decide who should do what and why. It's up to us to support the entire ecosystem and say, hey, we need it all. And what can we do to support you? And how can we put a lot of our state and federal monies to de-risk it for you folks? And that's within the day is I support groups and organizations that, one, ensure that farmers are the decision-making table. They're making decisions for their own future and their livelihood. And then two is majority money has got to go to them. And I've seen it firsthand with an amazing organization called Jacob's Farm del Pavo, which is the largest organic herb producer in the country, third largest cherry tomato producer, where the husband-wife combo basically realized that in order for them to succeed and small farmers to succeed, they had to create this private cooperative. And 70% of the revenue goes back to the farmers, not all in cash, but in a truck or seeds or water or soil tests or education, where it's like they ensure success by lowering all the other risks as a collective we.
Okay. So I think we're near the end of our podcast, and I want to make sure that, is there any other ideas? You've got so many ideas. Any other last thoughts that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, clearly I'm partial to the Seeds of Wellbeing Project. Anytime I hear someone say, oh, we'll get more mental health resources to producers, etc., I'm like, well, it hasn't been done yet. And there's still a huge gap on the urban side of things. Like, it's so that's not realistic and feasible. And anyone that says that is like, you need to do more research and figure it out and spend more time. Clearly, what I see the opportunities is around workforce development. So I've evolved my own ethos around like growing more farmers to actually saying, actually what we need to be doing is having more of this, knowledge transfer. So it's not just our older population of farmers, but, there's ways to be able to successfully transition. And it most likely is not with their kin, not their kids. But there's ways we can do it as a collective we in models that have already worked, where we can expand and support farmers. And so when you look at wolfing programs, when you look at homesteading programs, when you look at even the general concepts around, communities, smaller communities supporting communities, that's what we have to focus on. And the more support from mental health professionals, like the gentleman who came in to the conference too, which is really fascinating. The energy to which family farmers have and grow is amazing. So we just need to support that. We need to have more sharing. We need to have more farm tours. We need to pay our farmers for this stuff so they're not donating stuff. Any event that you hear of that is from farm fresh stuff, people have to pay for that stuff. Like that's the first and foremost. And they have to pay a premium. It's not donation based. So, I think the more we can do that, and the more we can bring folks from the urban sector to farms, so there's so much we can do. So, I'm hopeful. And of course, I would love to see more resources from, what you folks are doing in terms of expanding different programs. And people need to really question the metrics that has been done versus what will need to be done.
Well, I appreciate that, Vincent. And I really appreciate all your enthusiasm and your passion to support our ag community. Thank you so much. We want to thank our guests for their generosity and mana'o. We also want to thank all our ag producers throughout the islands, and especially those we have heard on the podcast for discussing ways they address the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of Hawaii ag production. Each story, each voice contributes to a broader understanding of what it takes to survive and thrive as we feed our communities. Wherever you may find yourself within our island agriculture economies, if you would like to share your story in our podcast, please contact us.